Picture the last time you sat in traffic waiting for a tunnel to open, or watched a documentary about a highway carved straight through a mountain and thought, how is this even possible? How do you move that much rock without spending 50 years doing it by hand? Maybe you have stood at the edge of a canyon on a family trip, looking down at a road that seems to have been poured into the stone itself, or watched footage of a building collapsing perfectly in seconds during a controlled demolition and felt that strange mix of awe and disbelief. We live surrounded by the results of something most of us never think about: the ability to break solid rock on command, safely, precisely, whenever we need to. What almost nobody knows is that this power, the one that built our railways, our canals, our highways, our cities, pressed against mountains that used to be impossible to cross, came from a broken heart, a dead brother, and a leaking can that nobody meant to leak. The answer to how humanity learned to blast through the earth itself does not begin with an engineer with a grand plan. It begins with a grieving young chemist in a small factory outside Stockholm, quietly trying to stop people from dying, who stumbled onto something that would end up reshaping the entire planet. In the autumn of 1866, in a modest laboratory built outside the Swedish capital, a 33-year-old chemist named Alfred Nobel was running out of options. He was not trying to invent a weapon. He was not trying to change history. He was trying to solve one very specific, very personal problem: how to make liquid nitroglycerin stop killing people, including, 2 years earlier, his own younger brother, Emil. Nobel was not thinking about mountains or railroads or continents. He was thinking about a single leaking metal can, sand, and whether he could keep his family's business and his own hands intact for another year. To understand why that leaking can matter so much, you first have to understand how impossibly hard it was to move earth and rock before that moment. In the early 1800s, if you wanted to cut a road through a mountain, dig a canal, sink a mine shaft, or carve a railway tunnel, you had exactly one tool at your disposal that could break solid rock at any real scale. Black powder, the same gunpowder that had been used in muskets and cannons for centuries. Black powder was slow to ignite, unpredictable in strength, and produced a huge, choking cloud of black smoke every single time it went off. Miners drilling into rock by hand, using an iron rod called a jumper drill and a hammer, would spend hours just to bore a single hole deep enough to pack with powder. A skilled two-man drilling team, one holding the rod and slowly turning it, the other swinging the hammer, might manage only a foot or two of drilled rock in a full day of brutal, blistering labor. Then they packed the hole with black powder, laid a fuse, lit it, and ran, hoping the rock face would crack the way they wanted, instead of collapsing sideways onto the crew, or worse, failing to detonate at all and leaving a live charge buried in the wall, waiting silently for someone to hit it with a pickaxe hours or days later. Tunnels that we would build today in a few years took decades. The Mont-Cenis tunnel through the Alps, started in 1857 to connect France and Italy, was expected to take up to 25 years using hand drilling and black powder alone. An almost unthinkable span of a working lifetime for the men who began digging it as young apprentices and might have finished it as grandfathers if they finished it at all. Mining towns in America and Europe were coated in black powder smoke every single day. The air thick and acrid, workers' lungs slowly ruined by decades of breathing rock dust and gun smoke in badly ventilated shafts lit only by candles and oil lamps. Cave-ins were common. Premature explosions were common. Death was simply priced into the job, an accepted cost of doing business, whispered about at dinner tables in mining towns from Wales to Nevada to the Swedish Iron Belt where Nobel's own family had roots. Alfred Nobel grew up inside this world of explosions almost from birth. His father, Emanuel Nobel, was an engineer and inventor who had built underwater mines for the Russian military, and Alfred spent parts of his childhood in St. Petersburg, surrounded by his father's experiments with explosives and machinery. As a young man, he traveled to Paris to study chemistry, and there he met Ascanio Sobrero, the Italian chemist who in 1847 had first synthesized nitroglycerin, an oily, colorless liquid that packed roughly 10 times the explosive power of black powder for the same weight. Sobrero himself was terrified of what he had created. Nitroglycerin was so unstable that it could detonate from a simple bump, a change in temperature, or even from being poured too quickly from one container to another. Sobrero reportedly refused to work with it further and warned against its use entirely, convinced that the substance was simply too dangerous to ever be handled safely by human hands. Alfred Nobel disagreed, or at least believed the danger could somehow be tamed. He returned to Sweden and, together with his father and his brothers, began experimenting with nitroglycerin as a commercial blasting agent, testing it in small batches, looking for ways to control its explosive power without losing control of it entirely. The results were catastrophic long before they were profitable. In September of 1864, an explosion tore through the Nobel family's factory in Heleneborg, just outside Stockholm. 5 people were killed instantly in the blast, among them Alfred's 20-year-old brother, Emil. Newspapers at the time described the explosion as so violent that windows shattered across the neighborhood, and the factory building itself was reduced to rubble in an instant, leaving almost nothing recognizable of the people who had been inside. Swedish authorities, horrified, banned Nobel from rebuilding the factory within the city limits, forcing him to continue his experiments on a barge anchored on a lake, quite literally floating his dangerous work away from anyone it might kill if it went wrong again. It would have been reasonable at that point for anyone to walk away from nitroglycerin entirely. Instead, Nobel became obsessed with a single goal: finding a way to make the substance stable enough to transport and use without it detonating unpredictably and killing the very people trying to work with it. For nearly 2 years, he tested combination after combination, trying to find some material that could absorb liquid nitroglycerin, soaking it up like a sponge, while still allowing it to detonate reliably when deliberately triggered with a blasting cap. A device Nobel himself had invented in 1863 using a small charge of mercury fulminate to set off a larger explosive on command. He tried charcoal, he tried sawdust, he tried brick dust. Nothing quite worked. Either the mixture was still too unstable, or it absorbed the liquid so completely that it lost its explosive punch entirely. Then came the accident that changed everything. During shipping, cans of liquid nitroglycerin packed for transport had begun to leak, seeping out through small imperfections in the metal containers. To protect the cans during transit, workers had packed them in crates using a soft, chalky, porous sedimentary rock called kieselguhr, made from the fossilized remains of ancient diatoms, tiny algae that had died and settled at the bottom of lakes millions of years earlier. When Nobel examined the leaked cans, he noticed that the nitroglycerin that had seeped out had been almost entirely absorbed by the surrounding kieselguhr packing material, turning the loose powder into a thick, moist, clay-like paste. Curious, he tested this paste directly and discovered something remarkable. The kieselguhr could soak up roughly 3 times its own weight in nitroglycerin while remaining stable enough to be dropped, shaken, even struck without detonating. Yet it would still explode reliably and powerfully when set off deliberately with a blasting cap. A packing accident, a small imperfection in a shipping crate that nobody had planned or designed, had solved the exact problem Nobel had spent years chasing on purpose. In 1867, Nobel patented this new material under the name dynamite, taken from the Greek word dynamis, meaning power. It could be safely molded into sticks, wrapped in paper, carried in a wagon, dropped, even set on fire without exploding, and it would only detonate when triggered by a blasting cap. For the first time in human history, a substance existed that combined the raw explosive force of nitroglycerin with something close to the safety and reliability of ordinary tools. Nobel had not set out to reshape civilization. He had set out to stop killing his own workers and to save his family's collapsing business. What he actually did was hand humanity a tool powerful enough to reshape the surface of the planet itself. The first wave of impact hit almost immediately, and it hit the mining industry hardest. Within just a few years of dynamite reaching the market, mines across Sweden, Germany, and the United States began replacing black powder with the new explosive. The numbers were staggering compared to anything that had come before. A single stick of dynamite could break through rock that would have required several times the volume of black powder to move, and it did so with far greater predictability, meaning fewer wasted charges, fewer collapsed shafts, and fewer workers buried alive by rock that fell the wrong way. Nobel established factories to manufacture dynamite across Europe and the United States, and by the 1870s, his company, Nobel Explosives, had become one of the largest industrial enterprises of its kind on the planet, with production facilities in Sweden, Germany, Britain, and the United States, exporting dynamite to mining operations on nearly every continent. Silver mines in Nevada, coal mines in Pennsylvania, iron mines in Nobel's own Sweden, all of them adopted the new explosive within a remarkably short window of time. Because the economic logic was impossible to ignore, mines using dynamite could extract ore faster, deeper, and with a meaningfully lower death toll among their workers than mines still relying on black powder. By now, if you have made it this far into a story about a Swedish chemist and a leaking crate of chemicals reshaping the modern world, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Someone who wants to understand how the smallest overlooked moments in history end up rewriting everything that comes after. If that curiosity is something you enjoy chasing, staying subscribed means you will keep getting these stories delivered straight to you. The strange accidents, the forgotten names, the tiny decisions behind the biggest changes in how we live, without having to go looking for them yourself. This channel exists for people who feel that same spark of disbelief we all felt. Learning that dynamite came from a packing accident, and there is a whole community here that shares that same hunger to understand the hidden mechanics behind the world we take for granted. So if that sounds like you, sticking around means you will never miss the next one of these stories. And honestly, discovering them together is half the fun. The second wave of impact reached far beyond the mining industry itself, transforming how entire societies moved, built, and expanded. Before dynamite, geography was closer to destiny. Mountain ranges were barriers that determined where cities could grow, where trade routes could run, where railroads could realistically be built. After dynamite, geography became something humanity could actively argue with and, more often than not, win. The Mont Cenis tunnel through the Alps, the same project once projected to take up to 25 years using hand drilling and black powder, was completed in 1871, years ahead of its original timeline, in large part because dynamite and improved mechanical drilling had been introduced partway through construction, dramatically accelerating the pace of excavation through solid granite. The Gotthard Tunnel opened in 1882 and stretching more than 9 miles through the Swiss Alps, relied heavily on dynamite to blast through some of the hardest rock formations in Europe, connecting northern and southern Europe by rail in a way that would have been almost unimaginable using older methods alone. In the United States, the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, depended on explosives to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountain range, one of the most physically demanding stretches of the entire project. Thousands of Chinese immigrant laborers, recruited by the Central Pacific Railroad, were tasked with drilling and blasting through granite cliffs so steep that workers had to be lowered over the edges in woven baskets just to plant charges by hand. While much of this earliest work still relied on black powder and the more volatile nitroglycerin before dynamite became widely available, the explosive principles Nobel had pioneered and the safer dynamite that quickly followed became the standard tool for railroad construction across the American West for decades afterward, allowing tracks to cut through terrain that would have been considered functionally impassable a generation earlier. Small mountain towns that had been isolated for generations suddenly found themselves connected to national trade networks within a matter of months, once a rail line could be blasted through the ridge, separating them from the rest of the country. And the populations of these towns often doubled or tripled within just a few years, as new economic opportunity flowed in along those tracks. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, and the Panama Canal, completed decades later in 1914, both relied on explosives to remove the staggering volume of earth and rock required to connect oceans that nature had never intended to be connected. The Panama Canal alone required the excavation of more than 200 million cubic yards of material, a volume of earth so enormous that without industrial explosives, the project would likely have remained impossible for engineers of that era to complete within any human lifetime. Entire tropical mountainsides were blasted away to create the Culebra Cut, later renamed the Gaillard Cut, a stretch of the canal that had to be carved directly through the Continental Divide, and dynamite, along with its more powerful chemical descendants, made that excavation achievable on a schedule measured in years rather than generations. Beyond the railroads and canals, dynamite reshaped everyday human settlement patterns in ways that rarely get mentioned in history books but mattered enormously to ordinary families. Quarrying stone for construction became dramatically faster and cheaper, which meant building materials for houses, roads, and bridges became more available and less expensive in growing towns and cities across Europe and North America. Roads that once had to wind slowly around hillsides because cutting through them was too costly and slow could now be carved in relatively straight, efficient paths, shortening travel times between towns and making regional trade and communication faster than it had ever been in human history. Dam construction accelerated as well, since blasting foundations into solid bedrock became far more practical, allowing engineers to build larger reservoirs and hydroelectric projects that would eventually help power the electrification of entire regions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The third wave of impact moved beyond industry and infrastructure into the far more turbulent territory of politics, economics, and global power. Explosives. Once they existed in a form that ordinary people, not just trained military engineers, could obtain and use, inevitably found their way into warfare and political violence as well as construction. By the late 1800s, the word dynamite had entered popular language as a symbol of both progress and terror, sometimes within the very same year. Anarchist groups in Europe and North America, seeking dramatic ways to strike against governments and institutions they opposed, began using dynamite in bombings, and newspapers of the era ran sensational headlines about so-called dynamitards, a term used to describe political bombers, spreading public fear of the very substance that had also been quietly making railroads and mines safer for ordinary workers. This dark side of Nobel's invention caught up with him in an almost unbelievable twist of fate. In 1888, when Alfred's brother Ludwig Nobel died while traveling in France, a French newspaper mistakenly believed it was Alfred had died and published an obituary condemning him, one that reportedly referred to him as the Merchant of Death, and stated that he had become rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before. Alfred Nobel, very much alive, read this premature obituary about himself, and by most historical accounts, it disturbed him profoundly, forcing him to confront exactly how the world would remember him if that had truly been his final chapter. Whether or not every detail of that newspaper story has been perfectly preserved by history, what is documented beyond dispute is that when Nobel wrote his final will in 1895, he directed the vast majority of his enormous fortune, built almost entirely on the manufacturing and sale of explosives, toward funding a series of annual prizes recognizing outstanding achievements in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and, in a detail that carries enormous weight given his own legacy, the promotion of peace between nations. The Nobel Peace Prize, one of the most prestigious honors that exists anywhere in the world today, was funded entirely by the fortune of a man whose life's work had been perfecting the chemistry of controlled destruction. The economic empire built around Nobel's inventions and patents also became a major force in global industry beyond explosives themselves. Alfred's brothers, Ludwig and Robert Nobel, expanded the family's business interests into the oil fields of Baku in present-day Azerbaijan, building one of the largest oil enterprises in the world during the late 19th century. And the technical expertise and capital generated from the explosives business helped fund and accelerate that expansion. The broader Nobel name, associated first with dynamite and later with oil, science, literature, and peace all at once, became one of the more strikingly contradictory legacies of the entire industrial age. A single family name stretched across both the machinery of destruction and some of humanity's highest ideals of intellectual and diplomatic achievement. Governments themselves also had to adapt to a world where powerful explosives were commercially available. Regulations around the manufacture, storage, and transport of dynamite tightened significantly in country after country through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as lawmakers scrambled to balance the enormous economic benefits of industrial explosives against the very real dangers of accidents and deliberate misuse. Licensing systems for blasting operations, safety codes for storage facilities, and international treaties governing the transport of explosive materials all trace their origins back to this period, when the world was forced to reckon, often for the first time, with the reality that a substance capable of building a nation's railroads was equally capable of tearing down its government buildings. The fourth and final wave of impact stretched dynamite's legacy across the entire globe and into the future of human civilization itself. Within a few decades of its invention, dynamite and the chemical principles behind it had been adopted on every inhabited continent, used to build railways across Africa and Asia during the height of European colonial expansion, to construct highways connecting the growing cities of South America, and to extract minerals from the ground in nearly every industrialized nation on Earth. During both World War I and World War II, explosive technology directly descended from Nobel's original innovations was used at a scale of destruction that dwarfed anything imaginable in the 19th century, a grim continuation of exactly the fear Nobel himself had confronted in that premature obituary decades earlier. At the same time, the peaceful, constructive applications of explosive technology continued to accelerate human development, powering the post-war construction booms that built modern highway systems, dam networks, and mining operations across dozens of countries during the 20th century's rapid economic expansion. Today, dynamite itself has actually become less common than it once was, largely replaced in most large-scale commercial and industrial applications by newer, cheaper, and often safer explosive compounds such as ANFO, a mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil that is now the most widely used industrial explosive in the world, particularly in large open pit mining and quarrying operations. Yet, the fundamental principle Nobel discovered by accident in that Swedish laboratory, stabilizing a powerful but unpredictable explosive material by absorbing it into a solid, controllable carrier, remains foundational to how nearly every modern industrial explosive is designed and manufactured. Controlled demolition, the practice of using precisely placed and timed explosive charges to bring down large structures safely in a matter of seconds, an entire specialized engineering discipline in its own right today, exists only because of the century and a half of accumulated knowledge about how to make powerful explosives behave in predictable, controllable ways, knowledge that begins in a very direct historical line with Nobel's original breakthrough. There is also a striking, almost uncomfortable irony sitting at the very heart of this story, one that Nobel himself seemed to sense even in his own lifetime. The same man whose invention made possible the tunnels, canals, and railroads that connected civilizations and lifted millions of people out of geographic isolation also created a tool that made warfare and political violence more lethal and more accessible than at any point in prior human history. He tried, quite deliberately, to counterbalance that legacy by funding one of the most prestigious peace prizes in the world. And in a further twist that historians still find remarkable, the very same Nobel Prize Fund now also honors extraordinary achievements in physics and chemistry, the exact fields of scientific inquiry that gave the world dynamite in the first place. A fortune built on shattering rock ended up funding a century of honoring humanity's brightest attempts to build knowledge, art, and peace instead. None of this, not the railroads that finally connected isolated mountain towns to national economies, not the canals that reshaped global shipping routes and international trade, not the massive open pit mines that fed the raw materials for the 20th century's industrial expansion, not the controlled demolitions that let modern cities safely clear space for new construction, and certainly not the Nobel Prizes that today recognize the world's greatest scientists, writers, and peacemakers, was the plan back in 1866. Alfred Nobel was not trying to reshape continents or fund global honors for human achievement. He was a grieving 33-year-old chemist standing over a small leaking can of nitroglycerin, staring at a crate of ordinary packing material that had accidentally absorbed the liquid into a strange, stable paste, simply trying to find a way to stop the substance from killing anyone else the way it had already killed his own brother. That single, unplanned observation, a small accident nobody had designed or predicted, ended up giving humanity the power to move mountains, quite literally, and to build the connected, tunneled, blasted, and reshaped modern world we now move through every single day, without ever once thinking about the small leaking can that made it all possible.